In this episode, you'll discover how rowing teaches valuable lessons which apply to high-performance work.
Feel the grip of the oar handle, smooth yet firm in your hands. Taste the salt of your own sweat and the occasional splash of water. It's all part of the journey. Welcome to another episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Each week, our host, Masters rowing coach Rebecca Caro, dives deep into the world of Masters rowing. Whether you're on the water or in the gym, join us to become a faster master. Let's go rowing.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a weekly episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Today, I have a guest who met me when we were both students together, but he has taken a pathway into elite sport and high-performance work that brings together really interesting threads between both worlds. Matt Brittin, welcome to the show.
It's so nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
So you started rowing as a schoolboy and went all the way to the Olympic Games. Give us a brief thumbnail of that trajectory.
Yeah, not super successfully at the Olympics, but yes, I was the son of a really good footballing father who had trials for Arsenal and Chelsea, and a netballing mother, and I was laughed at by them for my lack of coordination at ball sports. But then I went to a school at Hampton, which had a couple of old boats in the local boathouse, and a sport where they tell you exactly how to move appealed to me. And after being kind of pretty rubbish for a year or two, I started to get quite good. I was quite large. I had the chance of being put in a pair. One of the teachers at school was a guy called Martin Cross, who was training in the British team at the time. And I went in a pair with Martin, and I suddenly discovered a whole other level. Anyway, long story short, went on to be a really successful school crew. And Martin came back from the 1984 Olympics brandishing his gold medal and spoke at the school assembly. And it's the only school assembly I remember out of 6 years at school. And 4 years later, I was in the Olympic Village with Martin, in the spare pair, by the way, for the British team. So that was a nice start.
Well done. Amazing. And did you then stop rowing after that Olympics?
No, rowing actually encouraged me, because I was in the junior. We won everything as school crew 2 years running, which is quite exceptional at the time. It's been superseded now. And was in the junior team, won a couple of medals at the junior worlds, and that compelled me to apply to university. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. I was lucky enough to go to Cambridge University. Actually, as it turned out, at the tail end of the longest losing streak in boat race history. So I've got 3 boat race silver medals to my name. One of which was the race that was turned by the Oxford coach Daniel Topolsky into a book and then into a movie. So that very painful loss came back to bite me a couple of times. But actually, in my last year at Cambridge, I was elected president of the club. And the president of these student clubs at Oxford and Cambridge is the authority, and it's your job to produce a crew that will win the boat race. And I failed at that, but what I did do was bring in professional coaching for the first time. And as I was finishing as president, they said, well, you've committed to this new thing now, so we'd like you to become chair of the club and sort of see it through. So I chaired the club immediately after being a student for a few years until we won a couple of races back to back. And then I ducked out of it. So I think that's a nice kind of connection between, my passion for sport and sort of trying to run an organization that's, when I look back on it, was a bit of a pivotal experience to have as a, 20-year-old.
And of course, one of the critical things in those days about the president of a student boat club, and you mentioned the unfettered power, was there was no advisory board. You made up whatever rules you wanted. And that was part of the cause of the Oxford Mutiny, which is the book that Dan Topolsky wrote. So recognizing that the overlap between rowing and the administration and strategy or organization behind whatever you're trying to achieve at a very high level, what did you begin to realize in those early years that rowing was teaching you that then was useful beyond the river?
Yeah, so people who've worked with me over recent years will have probably got fed up with some of my kind of rowing stories and metaphors. But I've just stepped down out of a position at Google. So I was running Google in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe for the last 10 years, and working at the company for the last 18. So I spent a long time there, actually building teams and relationships and so on. And I remember one of the most valuable lessons for me was when I was back at the school, age of 15, and my coach, Steve Gunn, who went on to be a coach of Olympic gold medalists and a brilliant long-term successful coach in the British team. My coach, Steve Gunn, said to me, he was following us in a launch, and he said, hey, Matt, there's a piece of shit on the end of your oar. And I sort of looked down at the oar, and I was like, I couldn't see anything on it. And I looked back at him really sort of puzzled. And he went, no, the other end. And then you sort of realize, oh, that's what you meant. And it was quite a harsh coach, but his point was, you've got to take responsibility for what you're doing, Chief. And I tell that story because I think, in the world of organizations outside of sport, taking responsibility and sort of before you start blaming other people, thinking about, are you the piece of shit on the end of the oar? And are you taking responsibility rather than saying, well, I'm, in sales, I'm waiting for marketing to give me my leads, or, the product's not good enough. Actually, am I doing the best job that I can? And I think that's one of the big lessons in rowing is look after your own performance and the rest of the crew looking after their own. And I quite often think in organizations, that's not always the case.
Certainly, yeah. Being aware of when you're making excuses. And on the water, you are always vulnerable, because whether you're on the erg and you're getting tested or being seat raced or in a pair or in a single, you can tell how you're doing. And I remember my boat race career, we got coached by Mike Spracklin. He did our January training camp. And at the time, they hadn't selected the crews. And I remember thinking, that girl, I think I can beat her, and it's the classic oarsman thought. I was extremely young in my rowing career. That was in my second year of rowing. And I was so wrong, miles wrong. A, she had wonderful blade work, and B, she was a lot stronger than me. But I thought she was the one that I could knock off, And in a way, the mindset was right, but the self-appraisal was out of kilter.
Yeah, and look, I think we learn a lot as I say, I feel stepping down off this long, kind of fairly complicated job, I reflect that the stuff I learned from rowing was more useful to me every day than the stuff I learned at university, at business school, working for kind of top strategic consultancies, because it was the human stuff. And, I've been working in AI, and I feel that, in this really uncertain world where it's in vertical takeoff, when we know it's going to do amazing things, we're not quite sure what. One thing you can be sure of is the human side of things, the human experience are going to become more valuable. How we relate to each other, creativity, curiosity, critical thinking, a collaboration. And many of those things obviously come through hugely in rowing. And whether you're a masters rower who, like you and I, came back to it after our youth, or whether you come into it afresh, I think there are lots of lessons that you take from sport into the rest of life. I found it, really powerful, and I definitely wouldn't have been where I am, in the business world or as a person without those lessons.
One of the things that I have noticed from rowing is that you're in a squad, it's a competitive situation, and therefore I am against you until we're in the same boat.
Yeah.
And then we're in a collaborative situation, and we both have to back each other to the hilt. And that ability, as it were, to sort of flip from one to the other is a real rowing lesson that I'm not sure other sports particularly draw out.
I think that's a really good insight, and I think it's a really powerful one, and it's something that's quite unique in some ways to our sport, I think. And at work, the founders of Google, Larry and Sergey, had this phrase which was like, act like an owner. And their thing was like, make sure that you're sort of, we're moving really fast. It's quite a fluid organization. Take responsibility for what you're doing, that sort of thing, a piece of the shit thing. And I would add to that, and win as a team. So, you want to be the best you can be, but you also want to collaborate. And I took that through not just to internally, but also like working with customers and partners. We might be competing with them on some dimensions, but we're also really trying to collaborate hard. And it's something that, maybe you and I take for granted because we've learned how to do that. But many people and organizations have a sort of bias to being sort of aggressively competitive rather than sort of collaboratively competitive. And I think that's kind of different. And, many of my best friends now, dare I say it, went to Oxford University, and or people I competed against around the world from different countries. And that's one of the the great things, that our sport brings is friendship. I was just in Patagonia, and we went and did a little bit of rowing down at the Chilean National Rowing Centre, and hung out with a bunch of incredible athletes there. And there's an immediate sort of connection and scrolling through history and so on. But that's one of the great things about sport. It reminds us, that there's more that binds us together than separates us in this crazy world.
I think Masters Rowing is particularly good at that. And when I read the Facebook group Masters Rowing International, it is often once a week at least someone will say, I've got a business trip to name a town. Can someone introduce me? And there is somebody in the group who goes, you need to speak to, I'll PM you their details. And the visitor rowing experience, Mark Davies was always very keen that we should have a little passport card, sort of like a driver's license that says, Rebecca is competent in a single, and therefore, you should trust her if she turns up at your club. But I do think that sort of rowing friendships, and I've never found a rowing club that isn't fundamentally friendly, open to visitors, and welcoming to newcomers. And if you move somewhere new, join a rowing club, you will have a friendship group.
Quite right.
Now I want to talk about high pressure situations. Now you've been to the Olympic Games. You totally understand the sporting high pressure. I think probably the boat race perhaps was a more high pressure situation with TV cameras only on 2 crews. And as you pointed out, the silver medal, it doesn't exist. What were the lessons that you took out of high pressure situations, both from working to rowing and the reverse?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you say that, I still think probably sitting on the start line of a Henley final felt like the most intense pressure. And even now, you and I were on the commentary team when we started live streaming all the racing, which is over 10 years ago now. And I've commentated every year since. And, I get nervous just watching people sitting on the blocks there, because I remember that feeling of just one-on-one in this kind of cauldron. And so I think, there's something about that. I remember, as you said, I went to the Olympics. I was a spare, in the spare pair in 1988 in Seoul. And I remember, I think you'll forgive me telling this story. I remember Steve Redgrave, who had won his first Olympic gold 4 years earlier with Martin, who I mentioned earlier. And he was asked to do a little talk for the team. And he talked us through the night before and the run up to his Olympic final. And basically he had a terrible night. He barely slept. He felt awful. He felt sick. He was like, oh my God, I can't do this. What am I going to do? And then they got in the boat and they practiced, going afloat, and their race warm up many times at that time of day. And it sort of started falling into place. And then, of course, once you take the first stroke off the blocks, you're absolutely in the flow. And for me, it really sat powerfully, because it was a story of how taking confidence with those nerves and the adrenaline and the way your body feels, that it's a sign you're getting ready for a performance. And, in my work over the years, I had to do many, public appearances, speaking on big stages, tough media interviews, being grilled by politicians. And I think that, that sense of the nerves and the adrenaline coming, I'd always remember that lesson from Steve. And I found that really useful. I think, another lesson I picked up over the years, I think, is sort of getting your attention off yourself, like instead of going into yourself. And I know different people cope with pressure in different ways, as you know, but I find it really helpful to sort of get my attention off myself, focus on the process, whether it's just like, the feeling of the oar in my handle or whatever, seeing the other crew there, just kind of, that really helps. And, again, lots of people struggle with public speaking. I think a real lesson in public speaking is nobody knows what you were going to say. Nobody knows that you stumbled over something, you missed something out or whatever. Just focus on the audience. Am I connecting with them? And if you're nervous, finding a friendly face. Oh, there's Rebecca. I'm going to lock into her eyes. I'm just going to say the first line to Rebecca, and she's going to nod and smile back at me, and then I'm going to get going. So I think there are things like that, which is, the equivalent of the first stroke of the race, like just being prepared, knowing you're going to take it well, knowing that there's somebody there who wants you to succeed. That kind of stuff really helps.
You mentioned Henley Royal Regatta. Now you're a steward, which is for listeners who don't know, they're the people who organise and run the event. And the progress that Henley has made, you said 10 years of commentary. Can you reflect a little bit on what the trajectory has been over your time as a steward, and perhaps reveal some of the things that have been announced this week on changes?
Yeah, look, it's a huge honour to be part of the regatta, and I got a call from Steve Redgrave in 2014, I think it was, and he called me. I was on a train somewhere, and he said, "Hey, I've got some news. I've just been made chairman of Henley Regatta." And I was like, "Well, fantastic, Steve. I'm really delighted for you. What can I do to help?" And he's like, "No, I've got some more news. You've been made a steward of the regatta." And I didn't expect this. The stewards mostly were people with more gold medals than me, which is 0. I got a few other colours, and but then it turned out to be a full-time job for, at the time, 5 days a year until you die. And he asked me to come and help the committee think a bit more strategically about like where the regatta might be in 10 years' time. And with my consulting and business background, I had some ways of sort of helping them think through that. Anyway, long story short, I'm really proud of the fact that Henley sort of looks unchanging, and yet it's always evolving. And we just announced earlier this week 3 new women's quad sculls events going to be introduced in the 2026 racing schedule, 187th Henley Regatta. And that means that's, I think, 10 new women's events since 2017. So we're getting close to having parity in terms of numbers of open events and women events, which is, I think, an enormous change. You might say could have done it sooner, but I think watching, and I've been lucky enough to be commentating on the inaugural finals of many of those women's eights, other women's events that we've brought in, and it's wonderful to see, how it's kind of provided those opportunities for such bonds to be forged, whether it's within your crews or across competitors, by a new generation, and by many women who never had the chance before. So really proud of that. I think the other thing is we touched on, bringing the world, every race live and on demand since 2015. That's a huge team effort, and I've enjoyed learning how to do that. There's always more to learn, just like with rowing, and being part of the team that does that every year has been a real joy, because you get to watch the close, watch and feel the nerves, and bring hopefully a little bit of insight into those races.
Yeah, I was one of those women in the early years in a final, sadly a losing finalist, but it is very exciting racing at Henley Royal Regatta. And as the bowman, of course, I was first across the line, sadly.
Yeah, so I think, look, well, I'm glad you enjoyed the experience, and they say you win or you learn, right? So you probably learn more. But I think what have you seen over that 10 years, aside from the diversity improvements and the broadcast, is record international entries. And you might say maybe that's correlated with the broadcast, because like over half the audience tends to come from outside the UK, and ever better racing, partners becoming involved. We've moved to a 6-day schedule, sort of 80 races a day for most of the week. So it's a really packed place, but we try to make it really special. We're always listening to feedback, and we're always keen to welcome people from all around the world. So yeah, it's been a real joy to be part of it, and also to think about how the sport can continue to innovate and get better while looking, timeless and unchanging.
Well, I think that you've got very clear boundaries there and an incredibly ambitious goal. I hope it goes really, really well, because visiting Henley Royal Regatta, if our listeners have never done it, put it on your bucket list. It is a must-do event.
Yeah, and if you want to get a feel for it, you can go to our YouTube channel and watch any of the races. And actually, I was just having a quick check up. So I was lucky enough with my friend and fellow steward Sarah Cook, CEO of Rowing Australia, to be commentating on the race that's been most watched. I think over 300,000 views of a 2018 final between St Paul's School, junior men's crew. They broke the course record by like 13 seconds, and we know that I think the Kiwi 8 that went to Tokyo, won gold, have told us that they watched that over and over again, and many others have. It's such sublime rowing. So I think it's one of those places you can go every year when the regatta's approaching. When I'm doing my ergs, I put on a recording of the live stream for one of the days and just watch races back to back while I'm going through my hour of power, and just to try and remember how to commentate again. But yeah, so enjoy those if you are feeling you need a bit of summer sunshine if you're in the Northern Hemisphere.
Now, Matt, you have come back to rowing and left your high-pressure job. Talk a little bit about what it's like coming back as a master. So how old were you when you started training again regularly?
Probably 45, yeah, something like that. And so I finished my elite rowing career quite young. Went to university. I was the youngest person to row in the boat race at the time, and I think even still. And I probably hung up my international kind of vest at the age of about 22, 23. And most of my friends were still rowing, so I wanted a clean break. So I sort of stayed away, got unfit, and didn't want to kind of do any kind of ill-advised comebacks. I felt I'd found my level at sort of the occasional bronze medal, and that was it. And then I was invited back by a group of rowers at Molesey here, who were all sort of ex-international or Henley winner types, and I was by then getting fit again cycling, and it's been a joy coming back. Yes, there's an absolute recalibration, but the time off was sufficient that I couldn't remember what kind of erg score I should be getting, and I wouldn't have kind of felt it was going to be feasible. So the kind of gains you make as you start to come back are lovely. Then you kind of plateau a bit, and rediscovering the joy. And I think for me, and you as well, you come back to the sport after some time out. For me also, when my kids were getting old enough where sneaking off to go rowing in the morning wasn't too much of a drain on my lovely wife. It's partly about learning, but quite a lot of it is about remembering. It's kind of getting that straight and go, oh yeah, okay, I remember that feeling of getting a bit more run, or I remember what it's like when I actually pick the boat up a bit earlier, and those things. So getting those feelings right. And I've had the chance to race at the head of Charles in Boston, which is a fantastic, highly competitive race, and won a few different medals there, and just enjoy that. And also being able to go out. This year I bought myself a sculling boat. I was always been a terrible sculler. I was good in pairs, but never in singles, and so I've been trying to find the joy in sculling, which I am.
And you still rowed when you were doing a high pressure job. Talk a little bit about how you managed to balance keeping training while you were traveling, because you are not the only person who has this challenge.
Yeah, look, I actually, one of the things I think isn't discussed a lot in the world of work is how you manage your time well. And when I started at Google, my kids were really young, and I really wanted to take them to school a couple of days a week, but it was going full on crazy. And so I would put in my diary a block of time that was take the kids to school twice a week. And I'd say, look, it can move, but there has to be two of them somewhere within the week. You've got to treat them like the most important meeting of the week. It has to happen. And I found that really helpful. And then when I was my kids didn't need taken to school, I was coming back into rowing, I used to block my training time in the calendar and try and treat it the same way. And, I was doing lots of late night calls. I'm based here in London. The colleagues I work with were in California mostly. One of them's in Singapore. So I was doing 2 or 3 night shift calls a week. And so I started to go training in the afternoon. And then, as you say, when you're traveling, keeping that discipline going, like not having too many glasses of wine, going to the hotel gym and finding the rickety elliptical machine, but just getting it done. It was quite hard, I think. But I know, and that in rowing, rest is a key part of performance. And I think in working life, exercise is a key part of keeping your performance going. And I was always in a better mood. And then the more senior you get, and it's another thing I think I'm passionate about, the more senior you get, the more important it is the way you show up, because people might not see you. I traveled to one of the countries I was responsible for. I might only go there once a year. And so if I turn up and I'm grumpy and tired and, low blood sugar, it's not great. If I show up and I've just been for a workout and I'm feeling great and I'm in good shape, then you set a very different tone. And that's so important because it's part of the culture. People look at their leaders and they read a lot from them. So they don't want their leaders to be stressed and grumpy. They want their leaders to have time and be in the moment. So I found that a really important part of being a good leader, as well as trying to be a faster master.
Now, looking forward, what have you got on your horizon for perhaps next year?
Well, I've come up with this gimmick, which is that I'm not retiring from work, but I'm on a gap year. So I went straight for, as we talked earlier, from school to university into the world of work and rowing, and then work without rowing and full on work, and then work with rowing again. And so I realized I'd never had any time off. So I've got the luxury of a bit of time off, and I've spent a bit of it on upward parenting, which has been lovely, and a little bit of travel. So I think as I go into the next year, I'm starting to try to, what are the things I'm going to get involved in, for public good, as well as kind of helping mentor and work with other people in business. And also On the rowing side, one thing I put off, and we could have a whole different podcast about this, I've kind of put off doing weights. So I used to do a lot of weights, and I have been over reliant, partly because of the traveling, partly from having slightly dodgy back, on erging to keep myself mobile. And so this year, aside from trying to get better at sculling, so if I can go, if my maximum speed comes at a rate that's higher than 22 in the year ahead, I'll be pleased. And also just kind of putting the time into weights. And my wife actually, who's not really done a huge amount of kind of gym-based exercise, got into heavyweight training a couple of years ago, which is obviously brilliant as a woman in particular for bone density and health. And she shamed me because I've been, shying away from that. So weights and sculling and continuing to try to be ambitious about what I can achieve in rowing, even as I get older. And you are running up the down escalator, and there's no shame in that.
You are, but the down escalator takes you interesting places. I discovered about a new race that I'd never heard of on a lake in Italy. It's about 6.5K out and back round a very beautiful island, only for singles and eights. It's like, oh, I need to find something.
So is that Turin? Yes, some friends of mine just did that, and it's a beautiful race. So yeah.
So there are always new places to go. Some of them, are 2 and 3 year plans. But that's, I think, one of the things about masters rowing that people don't appreciate until you're in it, is it doesn't have to be the same every year. When we were younger, there's a distinct rhythm and pattern to the season. And with masters, something happens and you are not available. Fine. There's always next year.
Yeah, that's right. And, one of the things I treated myself to this year, sort of to mark, the taper out of work. So I was tapering off my job. I booked myself into Gillian Lindsay, the fantastic British rower, runs a series of camps, GL camps, she calls them. And I went on a master's camp in Sabaudia. And the only other time I've been to Sabaudia was my first year in the British national team as a senior. And so going back to that lake years later, and it being in my single with Jill and a fantastic group of masters, was a real pleasure, actually. And so it's a nice little treat that I'd highly recommend if you've got the resources to do that.
Matt, thank you so much for taking us through an incredible arc of your own personal journey and sharing your lessons for work and rowing and life and rowing, because I know that we will all reflect on our own situation and we can all see little bits of what you've described in what we have experienced.
Well, thank you for having me. And I do believe, the other thing we learn from rowing is quite often looking backwards is a good way of going forward. So kind of reflecting on where you came from and thinking about where you're going. Try not to crash into any bridges. So thank you, Rebecca.
Till next time.
We are part of the RowingChat podcast network. Please tell your fellow rowers about the show. If you've learned just one helpful thing from today's episode, please consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month by visiting fastermastersrowing.com/podcast.